So the 5 things: wind direction, thermals, terrain, line of sight, and canopy cover. So first we'll talk about terrain. For a lot of guys in the flat country, this is almost irrelevant to them. And they hear people talk about hunting elk and they're like, the thermals. But it's very common for guys in terrain country to deal with thermals. So here in the Ozark Mountains, where I grew up, in Virginia, where Matt grew up, we both dealt with thermals our whole life. And it basically comes down to the concept of understanding that just because the forecast says a west wind doesn't mean you're going to get in your stand and have a west wind. Thermals means that between the nights getting cold and the days getting warm, the air that is cold at night is falling into the valleys and going into the creeks and
sinking
in
the evening.
As the day warms up, air that heats up will then rise up the hill. So if we are standing in this location, say we're in a stand, and it is still dark, there's a good chance our scent and our wind is going to fall down this hill. Even though the wind may be forecasted out of the west, the thermals are strong enough that our scent is falling down the hill. But as the sun comes up and the air warms up, the scent will then start going up the hill. That's a pretty good...
In theory, yes. And so there's so many factors to all of this, and we're going to do our best to explain them throughout this video. But it doesn't take a ton of topography, as we're talking about terrain features, to make this happen, especially on lower wind speed days. It's a gradual slope, and you'll get a movement of air that you can experience thermal activity.
And during that time of the day where the sun's up, the air's still cold, there's going to be this fight between wind and thermals. Thermals falling down, but thermals also wanting to warm up because they've been heated. Say there's a spot where the air is warmer down below you because there's a lack of trees. That air is going to try to rush up, and so you'll have this swirl effect, which is oddly enough when a lot of deer like to move in the morning.
So in general, in terrain country, evenings, as it's getting cooler outside, it's sinking. Thermals are sinking. In the morning, as it's warming up, it's rising. That's a generality that you're going to find in terrain.
In afternoon hunts, you may have thermals still rising at the beginning of the hunt, but start falling towards the end of the hunt, right when you're wrapping up and the sun goes down. In the mornings, they could start out falling and then begin to rise. Now, let's move to terrain. We did thermals, now terrain. That really plays into the thermal pull. So we're still keeping in line with the thermals, but the steeper the terrain, the more likely thermals are going to play and be more extreme in their movement patterns.
Absolutely. The steepness is really going to determine that. So the grade, how fast and how much pull that's going to have, that can override wind conditions. So steepness, really absolutely have to factor in thermal play with your wind. I mean, as a bow hunter, this is paramount. You have to have a basis knowledge of where your stands are at in relation to topography. If you haven't thought about that, you need to go out and check and basically just test this stuff out.
Yep.
We'll show you how to do that in another video.
And so then let's keep in line. So there's 2. Now we're going to shift into the line of sight with the terrain and thermals. So if you're on a side slope, let's say you're on an easterly slope, you're hunting a shelf, and the wind is forecasted out of the west that day. That means that the wind is going to have to come over that ridge that you're in.
Up over top, and you're mid-slope, let's say.
And you're mid-slope.
We'll do that.
And so you have thermals, and it's a cold day. At the beginning of the hunt, you're hunting in the morning. Thermals are falling
Down the slope.
Trying to go down the hill, but the wind is coming over the top of that ridge and wrapping back and almost backdrafting in, giving you what appears to be an east wind.
Yeah.
So then...
Complete opposite.
Complete opposite. So then if the wind, the thermals start to change and warm up, that means now they're sucking up the hill. So you could be sitting in a stand with a forecasted west wind, but experiencing a strong east wind or easterly pull from the thermals and the terrain. All things to consider. A way to prevent that and fight that is by getting on the ridge, moving around and finding where, if the wind is forecasted out of the west and you're on an east slope, that's almost always a bad call for terrain country. But if you can catch days with a northwest wind and move up the ridge and climb a little bit in elevation to where you can see more to the northwest, there's a better chance you're going to have northwest overpower the thermal pull and overpower the backdraft, so you can still hunt that area, but you have to find the right conditions to make that work.
And it's all about, like you said, the line of sight and just trying to level out yourself with the horizon. That's why oftentimes ridge tops are going to be the most consistent, right? Because the line of sight matches the wind direction and that thermal pull, because you're up on top and not on a slope or a bench that are commonly found on slopes. It's just going to be way more consistent. So hopefully from the design of Habitat, you can orient yourself around, have stands that are on ridge tops, but there are places where it's like, okay, the bench is where deer are traveling. I need to be able to hunt there, but it's certain conditions that you can only hunt under, or it's a time frame. You get out early before the thermals start rising. So many factors that go into that, but line of sight definitely gives you a huge advantage.
And next up, continuing that line of sight, let's go with foliage cover or leaf cover or evergreen trees. Same thing can be true in line of sight as well as a leaf cover. So let's just take that setup on that east slope with the northwest wind, and we're looking for a good line of sight so we can have more consistent wind. If you go in early season and it's full canopy, there is a
99% chance.
Yeah, a 99% chance the wind is going to swirl, because imagine a river and the current going through, and it's just a straight, there's no debris, nothing. The water just goes from east to west. But if you start throwing in rocks and logs and different debris,
which is your tree canopies
or whirlpools, and that's all tree canopies, evergreens, oaks. And every time the wind blows through, there's whirlpools behind these trees.
It's different densities of leaf coverage and canopy coverage with whether you have leaves, oak leaves, hickory leaves versus cedar or pine. The wind moves differently, and it creates this basically, it's a lot of turbulence essentially.
Yep.
And you got to remember, you're 20, 25 foot up, so you're right there in and among the canopy. What's your wind doing? And it's going to be turbulent under those conditions. But what happens later in the fall? Well, most times in a deciduous forest, you have leaf drop. Now that material that was breaking up and creating that turbulence is gone. Yeah. So it's way more consistent.
Way more consistent. So that stand that's on that east slope, northwest wind, probably doesn't get hunted with full canopy. But as leaves fall, now we can get in there and have more consistent winds. So number 5 is wind speed, wind direction. So comparing wind speed, like I'll go through some of the conditions that, okay, some of my favorite stands on my property are side slope, in what we just described, where we probably need leaves to start falling. We need certain winds to get in there. We need thermals to be in play. So we need cooler temperatures. Yep. And I think of a stand we call Dalhart, where if you go in early and there's full canopy, the wind gets swirly. But we go in a little bit later, beginning in November, and thermals, we got cold days sucking downhill. We also have good wind speed, wind out of the southwest. We can see 300 yards to the southwest. That's all great. But if we don't have, let's say I'm trying to hunt a stand where the wind speed is 5 miles an hour, but I'm on a side slope, thermals will overpower wind speed.
And especially when you have that sharpness from a high to a low temperature-wise. Yep. Let's say it's 30s in the morning and then 75 in the evening. That's a big swing. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be a lot of movement of air from cooling to heating that has to be considered on a 5 mile an hour wind speed.
Yes. So, but then if you're on a ridge top, right on the edge of a ridge top, right at that crest, and scents falling off with the thermals, and the wind is all of a sudden supposed to come from, let's say you're on the north crest, so scents falling down the valley, but the wind is supposed to be out of the north, and it's 15 miles an hour. It's going to overpower the pull of those thermals. So also another thing to consider.
It's going to trump it, basically.
Yeah.
So you have all these factors, let's say, that kind of layer over it, and it depends on the seasonality, the timing of it, and the temperature for those days that really, for us, say, can we hunt that stand under these conditions? And most times we have very strict parameters because of the steepness of the topography in our region, where it's say, those are the conditions, it's suitable, the wind is going to operate in a manner that will allow us to be undetected while hunting it. And if it's not those, you find somewhere else, or you sit at home. because it's not, the juice ain't worth the squeeze on going in there, because the turbulence of that air, it's going to be a high risk for getting smelled and ruining
And
a
it
hunt.
may feel fine until they get close, and then they blow out of there because
and
your scent could just be setting below you, spinning all around, and not getting out of there.
And it may seem fine for 2 hours of the hunt, and then the wind speed dies as the sun sets, and then thermals override, and you're like, wait a second, this is the golden hour of activity, and now I shouldn't be here. That's a very common thing. So there's other places in the morning where we'll go in a little bit later and say, okay, the action of the thermals is done, the wind speeds are up, now we can hunt and hunt a late morning.
And after all of this has been dumped on you, consider that you're in a tree and it's bad. You've gone through all these and you're like, the wind just swirls. You could move 20 yards away and it be good. So just because of, don't rule out the entire area just because it didn't make the checklist, it didn't pass. You could move over to where we're standing in shade right now, right behind a big cedar tree. The sun's been up for a couple of hours now, and the thermals were, when we started this video, were pulling down, but now wind is trying to come up. We could move over where there's some sunshine and have way more consistent winds here. So it is a very complex thing to understand that.
For sure.
To understand thermals and all the things that come into play. But once you get a hold of it and understand it, it becomes pretty easy to figure out which stands or which trees are best for those site locations.
The best and most successful bow hunters are the ones who understand thermals and how they work.
And leaf coverage and wind direction and
all those 5 things.
terrain and all those things.